I've journeyed to southern Ohio today to bring you the story of the mysterious and fascinating lost tribe of Appalachia, the Carmel Indians, or the Carmelites. Now, what's so mysterious about them is that when white farmers began to settle in this region, they reported that a group of what looked like mixed-race people had already settled here, calling themselves the Carmel Indians. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that anthropologists and historians have traced them to an 1850s exodus from Magoffin County, Kentucky, in the north of the state, up over the mountains and settling right around these crossroads. And they form a very unusual group of what's called triracial isolate, somewhat related to the Melungeon ethnicity, but they carry certain connotations which are difficult to discuss because they come from a complex part of America's varied history. The three families most associated with the Carmel Indians are the Gibsons, the Nichols, and the Perkins families, who were supposedly settled here after that migration in the 1850s. But one of the names that doesn't go mentioned very often is that of the McCoppin clan, who has their main plot right here, and the first grave to be marked on Find a Grave is that of Robert McCoppin, who died here in 1859. He was born in 1790, deep in the heart of Appalachian Virginia, and he seems to have migrated as already somewhat of an elderly man. He's buried in 1859 next to his wife, and he had several members of his family who joined the Union Army, and he gave them some pretty interesting names. Now, Rob McCoppin is buried here in the foreground, but what's so important to note about his backstory being the first marked grave in this cemetery is the fact that he was born in Old Virginia, and some of the very few scholarly studies done on the Carmel Indians seem to imply that there were two separate migrations that resulted in their settlement of this community. One of them was primarily women with freed people of color. Their relationship would have been illegal, so they settled up over the mountains, and these folks mingled with an exodus going north from Magoffin County, Kentucky, and settling in the same valley around the Carmel Range. Naturally, these clans mingled together, and it was an interesting result, similar to the Melungeons, but a little bit distinctive looking as far as outsiders were concerned. Nowadays, it seems like the McCoppin family line has mostly left or died off in this county. The last marked burial, that of World War II veteran John McCoppin, who was buried in 1978. But what's fascinating is that his father is William T. Sherman McCoppin, buried right there on the left. And William's father is George Washington McCoppin. George's father was none other than Rob McCoppin, who's buried over here in what's probably the original plot of the cemetery and the earliest settlers of Carmel. And this is George Washington McCoppin, the father of William T. Sherman McCoppin, buried right there, and the son of the first McCoppin settler that I can find buried in this cemetery, Robert McCoppin from Virginia. I can't stress how important it is to take note of the fact that George Washington McCoppin, right after the Civil War, named his own son William T. Sherman. That's something that in the Deep South, where I come from, would not make you a very popular person in school. And William T. Sherman's son fought in World War II, buried right over here in the shadow of the Carmel Methodist Episcopal Church. We're looking now at the Carmel Methodist Episcopal Church, where many of these so-called Carmel Indians are buried. But before I tell their stories and visit their graves, I'd like to talk a little bit about using these racial terms because they have such a unusual character to them as an identifier. Appalachian pioneers would very often encounter people that looked similar to the Carmel Indians. They had olive-colored skin, black hair, blue eyes, reached incredible ages, oftentimes older than 100, and were known for having genetic deformities, the classic stump on the back of the head, an old phrenology term, and 6 fingers, also known for sometimes going deaf or mute. Now, what they identified this as was mixed race, and the Melungeons were people who had a black ancestor in their past, and these mixed race couples settled in the mountains very early in America's history. After that, a lot of them were having children with Native Americans in the mountain range, and they were simply identified as colored, because to have a drop of blood meant that you were a second-class citizen for the majority of American history. Naturally, very few people for the longest time identified as Melungeon or even as Carmel Indians, but nowadays, more and more people are starting to learn their history and self-identifying. Some of the oldest graves here at the Carmel cemeteries belong to the Gibsons, or the Gibsons, who are very well known as a clan among the Carmel Indians. Now, Ira Gibson is buried here under a fieldstone, and his parents were listed on the Baker Roll of the Cherokee. In 1850, he was listed on the census as mulatto, and later on as black. Newspapers referred to him as chief. When he died in the year 1906, he was 104 years old, and they had to build a 7-foot-long coffin to accommodate him. His kids have the look, in spite of the fact that he was supposedly from Virginia. There's a book, the Gene Patterson Bible, which contains the man's thoughts on the mixed-race peoples of Appalachia. He said the old-timers told him when he was young that the Gibson and Nichols families left Virginia and came to Magoffin County in the early 1800s. After a good amount of discrimination, they left north towards Carmel. So Ira Gibson was born in 1825 in Virginia, and at some point had changed the spelling of his name from Gibson to Gibson. And his daughter is buried here under a homemade tombstone. So she was born in 1883 and died 1954. Nowadays, there's a growing number of people who self-identify as Melungeon because the Melungeons were often called an industrious, hard-working people with a good sense of honor. But the Carmel Indian label really hasn't stuck nearly as well as Melungeon because they were viewed with a greater air of suspicion and downright derision because they lived more sedentary. They lived hand-to-mouth, oftentimes in the shacks on the side of the road and up in the hills. I believe they were called, some of them, Pocahontas Way, and it wasn't until the Great Depression that some of them bought small parcels of land to raise corn. Mostly they were known to just forage around the hills, raise chickens, harvest roots, and find what they could get. So the Carmel Indians were a group of people insisting they were Native American and white European mix, very sedentary. This was the main church in town that you see as you come in over the range, and the Carmel Methodist Episcopal Church is at the base of the mountain over here. Now, for a very long time, they lived helping the farmers, providing free labor and getting some food in return, but especially around the Great Depression, when racial hatred was on the uptick, a lot of them had to move and find more stable work elsewhere in Ohio, and especially in Michigan, where factories were booming. This used to be the Carmel Methodist Episcopal Church, which served a congregation of what some people call the Lost Tribe of Appalachia, the Carmel Indians, a mixed-race group of people who eventually stopped self-identifying as Carmelites altogether. Although nowadays, with the rising popularity of the idea of mixed-race Appalachian communities, the Melungeons, some people are starting to rediscover their family heritage, and I'd love to tell you some of the genealogy. You can see here the Weisskopf family is still going pretty strong. Russell E. Weisskopf was born in 1939. His wife, Reva, died recently in 2015. One of the oldest men in the county, Joseph Weisskopf, is buried right here. I'll tell his story in a second because his date of birth is pretty interesting, although the dates on the tombstone are not correct. And some of the people who would have more commonly been associated with the Carmel Indians, because they were very much alive in the Great Depression, are buried right over here. Grace, Anna, and James Weisskopf. Scholarly consensus, and not many scholars focus on the Carmel Indians, is that these people came here, the Gibsons, and the Weisskopfs, during an exodus from Magoffin County, Kentucky, just before the Civil War around 1850. However, when this man died, papers reported that he was the oldest man in the county, over 100, and this Joseph Weisskopf was born in the county 20 years before that exodus was supposed to have taken place. And I just noticed this, the McAlpins might well have changed their name to the McAlpins, which was a more readily recognized name. You've got here George Washington and William T. Sherman McAlpin. I've already talked about them. And also remember, especially with the McAlpin family, a lot of these people don't necessarily identify with the moniker of Carmel Indians. It's all kind of up for personal interpretation, but this community was certainly a mixed-race community of Melungeon adjacent triracial isolate people in the foothills of Appalachia. Probably the most easily identified with the Carmel Indians is the Nichols family, and their progenitor is listed as Jack Nichols, who has no known headstone, but is said to be buried towards the back of the cemetery. Jack's son, Abraham Lincoln, lived to be 103 years old and is buried in, I believe, northern Ohio or northern Michigan, because he had to leave the community in search of work. And Jack himself was listed as a Native American in a census taken in Morgan County, Kentucky in 1848, which is pretty much proof of the fact that a good number of these people did migrate from Kentucky, and they were Melungeon, or at least triracial isolate. And not only did many of Virgie Nichols' aunts and uncles through her grandfather Jack, one of the earliest settlers of Highland County, share that tan skin color that many people identified with the Carmel Indians, she did as well, and she only died in December of 2016. Lula Nichols is buried between her parents under these white crosses. She died young, only 35 years old, and was born at the end of World War II with dark skin. Now, another trait that she shared with the Melungeons was that she was deaf and mute, but she was still very beautiful. Her parents and grandparents don't have stones that I can find, but they looked like typical Carmelite Indians. Her elderly father was Logan, and his folks were Tiny Nichols and his wife, Mandy. Lula's great-aunt Loven was a beautiful woman from whose photo you can see great interest would have been taken, especially back in those days, and she's buried up in Alger. Now here's a fascinating little side quest at the Carmel Cemetery. I was interested in Melungeon history in Magoffin County because that's where they say most of the Carmel Indians came from on a mass exodus, and it combined the mixed-race people coming west out of Virginia and the triracial people coming north from Magoffin County. This elderly man was named Chief Billy Cole. Billy Cole was very well known as a moonshiner and was very obviously part Native American. Many of his grandchildren migrated to Oklahoma. So I figured that because there was that exodus from the county he was in, you'd see many Coles buried across Highland County, Ohio. And sure enough, the only Coles buried in this cemetery are Adam Cole and Martha Cole. Both were born in the 1920s in Magoffin County, Kentucky, which is really unusual because they say that migration happened in the 1850s, but the narrative further states that people would often go back to Magoffin County, Kentucky for the winter. And although there are no other Coles that I can find buried in this cemetery, they are all over this county. And by the way, this church is not the original, but an old Methodist church used to be on this property. More modern graves, a fellow Air Force veteran, Sherman Leroy Nichols. Smiths, the Smiths are a very popular family associated with the Carmel Indians. And over here you've got the McAlpins, or the McAlpins, because it seems like some of them might have changed their names to the McAlpin family. See, even right here you've got a Kentucky World War I veteran, Gibson, and Ida Gibson. And right up here you've got a Gibson who died 20 years ago. And this is the main road through Carmel. I have no way of knowing how old some of these shacks are, but they do look very similar to ones in old sort of scientific journals. And this is some interesting homemade grave art. And you can see Christine Goldie and Nichols McGinn. And many Nichols are buried, especially closer to the back of the cemetery. And you can see a large plot of Nichols right here, just as you walk into the front gates of the cemetery from the church. And just before we leave Carmel, this is the church belonging to the cemetery. It used to be a Methodist Episcopal church. We're driving right back through. You can see the sign for Carmel right there. And these are some of the old shacks that either would have housed the Carmel Indians or they would have worked at these.
Or Garch Road.
We're here in the small town of Marshall, only a stone's throw away from Carmel, which is where the Carmel Indians lived for many generations, and even to this day you can find their graves recently having passed, the Nichols, Gibsons, and the Gibsons. But over here in Marshall, I'd like to show you the grave of an early pioneer woman who kind of throws a little bit of light onto the question of when did people settle here. This makes me sad. On Find a Grave, Susan Weisskop's memorial is a whole lot better maintained, but it seems like in recent years it's fallen apart. But what's important to notice about this is that, again, the common consensus, if there is a consensus about the Carmel Indians, is that they came in from Magoffin County, Kentucky around the 1850s. But Susan Weisskop tells a different story. Now, before I go on, I should specify that genealogy is not an exact science after a certain point. What I do know is that Susan Weisskop, buried here, was born in 1808 in Delaware, and in 1830 her son Joseph was born in this county. In Delaware, she came from the Frump family. Now, this lends a little bit of credence to the idea that many people have that this consisted of two migrations which birthed the Carmel Indians. One of them, women going west from the East Coast to settle with free people of color. The other, the Melungeons, a triracial isolate, moving up from Magoffin, Kentucky. And we're still at the Marshall Cemetery, only a stone's throw away from Carmel, for the grave of Susan Frump Weisskop. And one of the things I've noticed is that I haven't seen any McCoppin graves. They might be here, I just don't see any of them. But what I do see, there are quite a few Millers buried here, and they're also buried over at Carmel. Weisskop is buried back there. There are a large number of Weisskops buried here as well, and it would be fascinating just to transport back and learn about the family dynamics, just what was going on between different clans in a county like Highland in southern Ohio in the early 1900s. I'd like to give credit where credit's due and talk a little bit about the story of Miss Violet Morgan, a historian of Highland County. Now, throughout the early 1900s and mid and late 1800s, the Carmel Indians were looked down on. They were seen as outsiders, but a young Miss Morgan went out of her way to approach some of the elders from the community, gain knowledge of their folklore, and put pen to paper, because the Carmel Indians are more than happy to tell their story. It's just not many people who will listen. From a young age, Miss Morgan began an open conversation with an elderly woman in the Carmelite community named Lizzie, and from her she learned the Carmelite story. She used this to write dozens of articles and hold seminars on their folklore, and it culminated in her magnum opus, Squaw Winter, a love story set in the local community. It's mainly thanks to the writings of one compassionate Miss Morgan that we know so much about the Carmelite community. When talking about strange and mysterious communities like the Carmel Indian settlement here in southern Ohio, it's important to remember that they were communities in every aspect. They included people from outside, and oftentimes they were crossroads. Literally, the Carmel settlement was a crossroads in Highland County, and one of the men who was the pastor at the church was Reverend Jacob Wilbur Kauser, the son of another reverend who was born around 1861. These men were both reverends in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and at least Jacob was a pastor at the church in Carmel in neighboring Highland County. Jacob and his father, Joseph, were both born here in Adams County, just north of the state line. Jacob in 1904 and Joseph in 1861. Joseph was the son of Jacob's grandfather, Thomas Kauser, who was born in 1811 in Ireland. It seems like his family immigrated to New York, and his mother died of some disease and is buried at an immigrant cemetery in New York in 1847. Something must have compelled Jacob's grandfather Thomas to move to southern Ohio, but whatever it was, Thomas became a very industrious man, raising a reverend son and a reverend grandson. Several of his children joined the Union Army, and he himself joined forces with the Union, although he was far too old for this, and sustained injuries that would ultimately end his life many years later. We're here in the small community of Sinking Springs at the southern edge of Highland County, where Jacob Cowser is buried. He served as the Reverend of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the community of Carmel until his death in 1943. And if the stories about the Carmel Indians are to be believed, up until the Great Depression, they were journeying through this community to make their way back to Magoffin County, Kentucky, which is where supposedly they originated. We're heading up now over the range that leads to Carmel, about 7 minutes north of Sinking Spring, and although it's not really any kind of scientific study, I'd like to get a map of counties in Ohio and show you the scattering, like the population density of some of the families associated with the Carmel Indians. It'd be really fascinating to see not only that, but also how many are buried in each cemetery down here around Carmel, because I would be willing to bet that they were segregated more or less into the Methodist Episcopal Cemetery at the church in Carmel, right on the crossroads.